You have 30 days to cap that illegal well, Mr. Henderson. The voice was a grating symphony of entitlement, a sound that scraped against the natural tranquility of my property like a shovel on stone. I turned slowly from the well house, where I had just finished my weekly maintenance check on the pump. Standing at the edge of my land, just beyond the ancient, lichen-covered stone wall that had marked its boundary for 2 centuries, was a woman. She was ample, squeezed into a violently turquoise polo shirt, bearing a vaguely fascistic eagle and wreath logo, the emblem of the new subdivision that had metastasized on the far side of my woods. Her arms were crossed over a chest that seemed to be in a constant state of aggressive projection. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice calm, betraying none of the immediate, cold annoyance that had settled in my gut. "You'll have to repeat that. I don't believe we've been introduced. I am Karen Miller, president of the estates at Whispering Pines Homeowners Association," she announced, as if presenting credentials to a lesser dignitary. "And that structure," she pointed a thick finger tipped with a French manicure at the small stone well house my great-grandfather had built, "is an unapproved outbuilding. The well itself is a clear violation of community covenants regarding water usage and ground contamination." I took a slow breath, letting the clean, pine-scented air fill my lungs. This was my sanctuary. 150 acres of rolling timberland and pasture in central North Carolina, anchored by a spring-fed creek and this old farmhouse. My family had owned this land since before the Civil War. I had been born in the front bedroom, and after 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, I had come back here to retire, to find the peace that a career of building things in loud, chaotic places had denied me. For the past 2 years, I had found it. The only sounds were the whispering pines of the property's name, the chatter of the creek, and the low hum of the well pump. Until then. The estates at Whispering Pines, a cancer of beige vinyl siding and meticulously manicured, chemically saturated lawns that had erupted on what used to be Old Man Abernathy's farm. They had clear-cut 200 acres of hardwood forest to make way for their cookie-cutter McMansions, and in doing so, had become my neighbors. I had paid them no mind. My property was an island, legally and spiritually separate from their suburban archipelago. My deed was ironclad, my property lines surveyed and recorded a century before their developer had even been a gleam in his father's eye. Ma'am," I began, choosing my words with the care of a sapper probing for a tripwire. "This property is not, nor has it ever been, part of any homeowners association. This well was drilled in 1938. It is grandfathered under every conceivable state and county code. It is, in fact, a registered historical water source with the county." She produced a small, contemptuous laugh. "That's irrelevant. Your historical property directly abuts our development. The runoff from your unkempt land affects our property values. The existence of an unmonitored private well presents a clear and present danger to the community aquifer. The board has voted. You will receive a formal notice. Cap it, or we will have it capped for you and place a lien on your property to cover the costs." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was breathtaking. It was a declaration of war. She stood there on the other side of my wall, a petty tyrant in polyester, attempting to project her microscopic authority onto a sovereign kingdom. She had no legal standing, no jurisdiction, no power here, and she knew it. This was not about legality. It was about power. It was a test, an initial probing attack, to see if the target was soft. I gave her a look that I had on previous occasions reserved for incompetent contractors and junior officers with more ambition than sense. It was a look of profound disappointment and patient, simmering danger. "You are trespassing," I said, my voice dropping a full octave. "The edge of your community's property is 20 feet behind you, at the survey markers. I suggest you return to it. Do not set foot on my land again." For a moment, her bluster faltered. My tone, devoid of anger but full of an unyielding finality, seemed to penetrate her thick hide of self-importance. She took an involuntary step back, but the retreat was only tactical. "Ah, you'll be hearing from our lawyers!" she shrieked, her voice cracking into a higher register. She then turned with a huff, her wide-set khakis making a swishing sound as she marched back toward a golf cart parked on the pristine asphalt of a road named Golden Meadow Lane. I watched until the whining electric motor of her chariot faded into the distance. The silence that returned felt different. It was no longer the silence of peace, but the quiet of a battlefield before the first artillery barrage. I looked at the old stone well house, its mossy roof dappled in the afternoon sun. It provided the cleanest, coldest water I had ever tasted. It was the lifeblood of this farm. It was my water. She had made a grave miscalculation. She thought she was dealing with some folksy old farmer. She was not. She had just declared war on Colonel Thomas Henderson, United States Army, retired. And I had managed campaigns with far more complex logistics and far more dangerous enemies than a suburban homeowners association. A slow, dangerous calm settled over me. The war had begun. The first salvo in her paper assault arrived 3 days later. It was not a letter from a lawyer. That would have been too professional, too legitimate. This was something far more insulting. It was an official violation notice, delivered by certified mail, a tactic designed to intimidate and convey a sense of legal weight it did not possess. I held the envelope in my hand, noting the quality of the paper. It was a thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of material chosen by people who believe the vessel is more important than the contents. The return address was embossed, not printed, with the same vaguely fascistic eagle logo from her polo shirt, encircling the words, "The Estates at Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors." It felt less like correspondence and more like a formal indictment from a kangaroo court. I slid it open with a letter opener my father had used, its handle worn smooth by decades of use. Inside, a single sheet of matching heavy bond paper unfolded. The text was printed in an elaborate flowing script font, a parody of Jeffersonian elegance. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic aggression. It listed 3 specific violations. First, the construction and maintenance of an unapproved outbuilding, well house, in violation of Covenant 14.3, aesthetic uniformity. Second, the operation of an unregistered private water extraction system in violation of Covenant 9.1, community resource management. And third, my personal favorite, failure to maintain property landscaping to community standards, resulting in potential pestilence and vermin infestation, in violation of Covenant 7.5, property tidiness and upkeep. At the bottom, in a bold, severe font, was the prescribed remedy and penalty. The aforementioned violations must be rectified within 30 days of receipt of this notice. Rectification includes the complete removal of the offending structure and the professional capping of the illegal well. A fine of $100 per day will be assessed for each day the property remains in noncompliance. It was signed in a flourish of arrogant blue ink. Karen Miller, President, EWPHOA. I read it twice, the cold, methodical anger inside me solidifying into a block of ice. This was not a legal document. It was a work of fiction, a fantasy of power written by a woman who desperately wished she had some. The covenants she cited were irrelevant, as I was not a signatory to them. The fines were unenforceable, the threats were hollow, but it was an escalation, a deliberate act of harassment designed to bully and overwhelm. They had mistaken my desire for peace as a sign of weakness. They assumed that a retired man, living alone, would be easily cowed by official-looking paper and threats of financial penalty. This is the fundamental error of the tyrant. They cannot comprehend a world where their authority is not absolute. They see a quiet border and assume it is undefended. I walked from the kitchen to my study, the letter in hand. My study was the nerve center of my life, an organized space of oak bookshelves, topographical maps, and filing cabinets. For 30 years, my life had been about plans, logistics, and execution. I had overseen the construction of airfields in deserts and bridges over hostile rivers. I knew how to manage a campaign, and this was, without a doubt, a campaign. I pulled a new 3-inch D-ring binder from a box in the supply closet. It was heavy, black, and built for serious work. From my desk drawer, I took a label maker and carefully typed out the title for the spine: Operation Headwaters. I 3-hole punched Karen Miller's ridiculous letter, the sharp chunk of the machine, a deeply satisfying sound. It became the first document, Exhibit A, placed carefully behind the first tab, which I labeled Initial Hostile Contact. This binder would become my field manual, my opposition research file, the central repository for every piece of intelligence, every communication, every photograph, and every thought related to this conflict. Emotion was a liability in a campaign. Documentation was ammunition. My objective was not merely to defend my property. That was a given. My objective was total victory. I would not just defeat this woman, I would dismantle her entire power structure. She had initiated this conflict, but I would choose the time, the place, and the conditions of its conclusion. She had fired a paper bullet. I was going to drop a strategic bomb. The first phase of any campaign is reconnaissance. Know your enemy, know the terrain. My enemy was Karen Miller and her HOA board. The terrain was a battlefield of bylaws, county codes, and state statutes. I needed maps. My first stop was the estates at Whispering Pines community website. It was a ghastly affair, full of stock photos of smiling, unnaturally diverse families and professionally staged pictures of their identical houses. Buried under a tab labeled Resident Resources was the treasure I sought. The complete covenants, conditions, and restrictions, C and Rs, the community bylaws, and the minutes from the last 2 years of board meetings. I downloaded every single file, creating a new folder on my computer desktop titled Enemy Doctrine. For the next 2 days, I did nothing but read. I printed out the entire 300-page CC and R document and sat at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee, a red pen, and a yellow highlighter. It was as dense and poorly written as any government contract I had ever been forced to decipher. But within that morass of legalese and petty rules, I began to find patterns, weaknesses, and contradictions. The section on aesthetic uniformity was a tyrant's dream, a litany of approved paint colors, mailbox designs, and lawn ornamentation. No garden gnomes, no basketball hoops left out overnight. Holiday decorations could only be displayed within a specific, board-approved time frame. It was a blueprint for a life of beige conformity. But I also found procedural requirements, clauses detailing how violations must be notified, the appeals process, and the specific legal steps the board must take before placing a lien. Karen's letter had skipped half of them. That was sloppy. I highlighted each procedural failure in yellow. The meeting minutes were even more revealing. They were a chronicle of Karen's reign. I saw her name dominate every page, her motions passing unanimously, her voice clearly the only one that mattered. The other board members, a treasurer named Arthur Pinter, a secretary named Brenda, and 2 members at large, were ghosts, their names only appearing to second Karen's motions. Arthur, the treasurer, seemed to be the most active, presenting dry financial reports that were approved without question. The minutes showed a pattern of levying fines for the most trivial of infractions, with the revenue from these fines directed into a line item vaguely labeled Community Beautification Fund. I made a note of that. Vague funds are where bodies get buried, but the real breakthrough came not from their documents, but from the counties. I spent an entire afternoon on the County Register of Deeds online portal, pulling up the original plat maps for the development. And there it was, in black and white, on the master plan filed by the developer a decade ago. A thick, blue line delineating a riparian buffer and conservation easement. It ran the entire length of the property line between my land and theirs. More importantly, I found a specific notation, referencing a state statute, right next to a symbol marking my well. It read, "Existing historical water source, Gable Spring, per North Carolina General Statutes, Section 143-215. All development must maintain a 100-foot setback. Source protection zone in effect. Gable Spring." That was the old name for the source that fed my well, named after the family who owned this land before mine. It wasn't just my well. It was a registered, protected, and legally significant natural resource. And then I found the smoking gun. I cross-referenced the developer's filings with the Public Utilities Commission records. The estates at Whispering Pines did not get their water from the municipal supply. The cost to run a main line that far out would have been prohibitive for the developer. Instead, the community was serviced by a private utility company, a subsidiary of the developer, which operated a community well system. The system drew its water from 2 primary wells located at the lowest point of their property. The lowest point that just so happened to be directly downstream from Gable Spring. The irony was so rich, so profound, it took my breath away. Karen Miller, in her quest for absolute aesthetic control, had declared war on the very source of her own subdivision's water. She was trying to cap the headwaters of her own river. This piece of information was more than ammunition. It was a tactical nuclear weapon. But it was not yet time to deploy it. First, I needed to confirm my intelligence with a higher authority. The next morning, I placed a call to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Protection, Division of Water Resources. I navigated the automated phone tree with the patience of a saint, finally reaching a bored-sounding administrative assistant who transferred me to a junior hydrologist, who then passed me up the chain to a senior enforcement officer named Frank. Frank had the weary, cynical voice of a man who had spent 20 years dealing with idiots. He listened to my story without interruption, the only sound on his end the occasional scratch of a pen. "So let me get this straight, Colonel," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and engaged after I mentioned the plat map notation and the state statute. "This HOA president is ordering you to cap a registered springhead because she doesn't like the look of your well house." "That is the tactical summary, yes," I replied. I could hear him typing on a keyboard. "Gable Spring? Yep, I see it right here in the state registry, classified as a Class 1 primary water source. You could build a nuclear reactor on that land easier than you could get a permit to cap that spring." He paused. And you're telling me the estates at Whispering Pines draws its water from wells just downstream? Approximately 500 yards southeast of my well, yes, according to the utility filings. A low whistle came through the phone. Oh, she has no idea. She literally has no idea. Colonel, not only is her demand illegal, but if you were to, say, introduce any kind of contaminant into your well, you could theoretically poison her entire neighborhood. The law protecting your spring isn't just to protect you. It's to protect them from you, and everyone from everyone else. This is a source water protection zone. What she's demanding isn't just a code violation. It's a potential public health crisis if she sends some yahoo out there to start digging. So the state would take an interest in this matter, I asked. Take an interest? Frank chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Colonel, we live for this stuff. This is the kind of glorious, weapons-grade stupidity that makes my job worthwhile. Give me the HOA's official name and this woman's name. I'm opening a case file right now. We'll be sending them a letter of inquiry that will make their lawyer's hair stand on end. Don't you do a thing? Let her keep digging her hole and document everything. I gave him the information, along with the case number I wanted referenced in all correspondence. Operation Headwaters. Frank laughed out loud at that. I like your style, Colonel, he said before hanging up. I now had air support. My reconnaissance was complete. The next phase was to build a ground force, an insurgency. I knew, from reading the board meeting minutes, that I could not be the only resident who had been targeted by Karen's reign of terror. It was time to find my fellow insurgents. My first visit was to the oldest resident of the estates at Whispering Pines, a woman whose name I had seen repeatedly in the meeting minutes. A Mrs. Gable. The irony of her name was not lost on me. She lived in a small, neat house at the end of a cul-de-sac, the only house in the entire development with a riot of colorful, lovingly tended flowers in the front yard, instead of the HOA mandated boxwoods and crepe myrtles. It was a small act of rebellion. She answered the door, a tiny woman with kind eyes and hands gnarled from a lifetime of gardening. I introduced myself as her neighbor from the old Henderson farm. Her eyes lit up with recognition. Oh, the Henderson place. My husband and I used to admire your family's land so much before he passed. It's beautiful. I explained that I was having a small issue with the HOA and was wondering if she had ever had any similar experiences. It was like opening a floodgate. For the next hour, over a glass of iced tea, she told me a story of relentless, petty harassment. Fines for her bird bath, an unapproved water feature, fines for her wind chimes, noise pollution, and most recently, a formal demand that she remove the small ceramic garden gnomes nestled among her roses, which Karen had deemed tacky and detrimental to the community's upscale aesthetic. She called my little Wilhelm a detriment, Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling with indignation. He was a gift from my granddaughter. I listened patiently, taking notes in a small pocketbook. I explained to her that the HOA's power was not absolute and that their own procedural rules were often their biggest weakness. I told her I was preparing a formal challenge to the board's authority and asked if she would be willing to provide a written statement about her experiences. Young man, she said, her eyes glinting with a newfound fire. I will sign anything that gets that woman out of my petunias. I left her house with a signed, notarized affidavit detailing 3 years of harassment and a powerful new ally. My next stop was the Martinez family. I had seen their name in the minutes regarding a fine for leaving their son's basketball hoop at the edge of their driveway overnight. They were a young couple, both active-duty Air Force stationed at the nearby base. I found Mr. Martinez in his garage, organizing his tools with military precision. He was wary at first, as soldiers often are when a stranger comes to their door. But when I introduced myself as a retired Army officer and explained my purpose, his posture relaxed. He and his wife, a sharp, no-nonsense flight nurse, invited me in. Their story was one of constant, nitpicking torment. They were fined because their trash can was visible from the street for 2 hours after the garbage truck had come. They were fined because their son's bicycle was left on the lawn. The basketball hoop incident was the final straw. "We're on rotating shifts," his wife explained, her voice tight with frustration. "Sometimes we get home and we're just exhausted. We're not slobs. We're just trying to raise a family. This woman acts like we're living in a war zone, but the only enemy I see around here is her." I told them about my well, about the state investigation, and about my plan. I could see the strategic appreciation in their eyes. They understood a coordinated campaign. "What do you need from us, Colonel?" Mr. Martinez asked, his tone shifting from that of a beleaguered homeowner to that of a fellow serviceman. "See copies of every violation notice and proof of payment. A written timeline of your interactions with Mrs. Miller. And when the time comes, I need you to be willing to stand up in a public meeting and state your case." "Done," his wife said without hesitation. "Just tell us when and where." I had my insurgency, a respected elder of the community and a young, active-duty military family. Two unimpeachable sources who could testify to Karen's pattern of abuse. The seeds of rebellion were planted. Now I needed to bring in the heavy artillery. It was time to hire a lawyer. I did not want just any lawyer. I needed a specialist, someone who understood not just the law, but the specific type of warfare I was engaged in. I needed a warrior. After 3 days of research and a few calls to old contacts from my days at Fort Bragg, I found him. David Chen, attorney at law. His online profile was brief and to the point. West Point graduate, 10 years in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, with a specialization in administrative and contract law. Now in private practice, focusing on real estate and homeowner disputes. The perfect resume. His office was in a modest brick building in a nearby town, a far cry from the glass and chrome towers favored by corporate law firms. David himself was a man who radiated a quiet competence. He was lean, sharp, and had the calm, watchful eyes of someone who has seen true chaos and is not impressed by the civilian version of it. We shook hands, and I sat down opposite his uncluttered desk. "Colonel Henderson," he said, with a slight nod of respect. "My father was Corps of Engineers, built pontoon bridges in Vietnam. He said it was the only branch of the Army that created more than it destroyed." "He was a wise man," I replied. "He also said never to pick a fight with an engineer, because they've already calculated the load-bearing capacity of the moral high ground and mined all the approaches. So what can I do for you?" Instead of answering, I lifted the heavy black binder from my briefcase and placed it on his desk with a solid, definitive thud. The label, Operation Headwaters, was facing him. He looked at the binder, then at me, and a slow grin spread across his face. "I haven't seen one of these since I was reviewing after-action reports in Kandahar." "All right, Colonel. Let's see your opposition research." For the next hour, I walked him through the campaign plan. I presented him with Exhibit A, the initial violation notice. I showed him the highlighted copies of the HOA covenants, pointing out the procedural violations. I laid out the county plat maps, the state water resource regulations, and the utility commission filings. I gave him my notes from the interviews with Mrs. Gable and the Martinezes, along with their signed affidavits. Finally, I told him about my conversation with Frank at the DEP and the official state-level inquiry that was now underway. He listened intently, flipping through the tabs, his professional demeanor mixing with an almost gleeful appreciation for the thoroughness of the preparation. He picked up the plat map, tracing the conservation easement with his finger. "She wants to cap the source of her own subdivision's water," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's beautiful. It's a perfect, self-contained kill box. She has no legal ground, she's violating her own bylaws, and she's running afoul of state environmental law. Colonel, this isn't a case. It's a turkey shoot." "What's our next move?" I asked. "We send a letter," David said, leaning back in his chair. "But not a normal lawyer letter. We're not going to ask them to cease and desist. We're going to inform them with extreme prejudice of the facts on the ground. We will cite the state statutes she is violating. We will reference the active DEP case file number. We will mention her potential personal liability for willful misconduct and for threatening a public utility resource. We will demand a full, written retraction of all notices and fines and a formal apology. And we won't send it to her. We'll send it via courier to every single member of her board, individually, at their homes. The goal is to isolate her from her support structure," I concluded. "Exactly," David confirmed. "We let the weaker ones, the secretary and the members at large, stew in the legal liability for a few days. We want them to understand that their dear leader has marched them into a minefield. But we're not going to ask for a response by a certain date. We're going to let them sit with it. The next move has to be hers. We want her to walk deeper into the trap." He drafted the letter while I was in his office. It was a work of art, a 4-page tactical missile of precise legal language and thinly veiled threats. It was firm, factual, and utterly terrifying. Reading it felt like watching a battleship's main guns being aimed directly at you. By the time I left his office, I felt 10 feet tall. The professional reinforcements had arrived, and they were everything I had hoped for. The counter-salvo was about to be launched. The letters were delivered by courier the following Monday. I imagined the scene. The polite knock on the door, the signed receipt, the opening of the crisp envelope, and the slow dawning horror on the faces of Brenda the secretary and the 2 anonymous members at large. I pictured Karen Miller receiving hers, her face purpling with rage as she read David's calm, methodical dissection of her authority. For a week there was silence, a pregnant, watchful quiet. No new notices appeared in my mailbox. No angry golf carts patrolled my property line. It was the calm before the storm. I knew she would not retreat. Her entire identity was built on the projection of power. To admit error would be to cease to exist. She would escalate. I was counting on it. The escalation, when it came, was even more clumsy and ill-conceived than I had anticipated. She completely ignored David's letter. There was no response, no acknowledgement. Instead, she chose a direct action, a show of force. It was a Thursday morning. I was in my workshop, restoring an old piece of furniture, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy diesel engine and the clank of machinery coming down the road that bordered my property. I walked out to the stone wall and looked. Parked on Golden Meadow Lane was a large flatbed truck, and unloading from it was a small backhoe. With it were 3 men in the uniforms of a company called Miller Environmental and Excavation. Karen Miller was there, of course, directing the operation from her golf cart like a pasha in a sedan chair. She pointed toward my well house. "Right there," she commanded, her voice carrying across the field. Tear that little shack down first, then we'll get the drillers in to cap the well. The foreman, a heavy-set man with a sunburnt neck, looked from her to my property with a hesitant expression. "Ma'am, are you sure about this? This looks like private land." "It is a public nuisance," she snapped. "I am the president of the HOA. I am ordering you to remove it. Our lawyers have approved it." It was a blatant lie, and we both knew it. This was her blunder, her critical mistake. She was moving from paper threats to physical action, crossing a line from civil harassment to criminal trespassing and destruction of property. I had prepared for this contingency. I walked back into my house and retrieved 2 items: a small high-definition video camera and a laminated copy of the county plat map. I hit the record button as I walked back out, my stride unhurried. I reached the stone wall just as the backhoe operator was about to lower his bucket. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting clearly, "I suggest you stop immediately." The men froze. Karen Miller's head whipped around. "You can't stop this, Henderson. This is a sanctioned community action." I ignored her, addressing my words only to the foreman. "Sir, my name is Thomas Henderson. I am the owner of this property. You are about to commit criminal trespassing and felony destruction of property. I am filming this encounter, and your company's name and truck license plate are clearly visible." The foreman's face went pale under his tan. He walked over to the wall. "Ma'am, this fella says he's the owner." "He's a crazy old man," Karen shrieked. "I am the legal owner," I continued calmly, holding up the laminated map. "This is the official county plat map. As you can see, this stone wall is the property line. Everything on this side is my land. Furthermore, this well is part of the Gable Spring System, a state-protected water source. If your equipment so much as scratches the ground on my property, your company will be in violation of North Carolina General Statute 143-215. The fines for that start at $10,000 a day, per violation." I then gave him the final, crushing piece of information. There is also an active investigation into this matter being conducted by the State Department of Environmental Protection. This is the case number. I read the number aloud, slowly and clearly for the camera's microphone. I'm sure my attorney, David Chen, would be happy to add Miller Environmental and Excavation as a co-defendant in the lawsuit he is currently drafting. The foreman looked from my calm face to the sputtering, enraged face of Karen Miller. He was a working man, not a fool. He knew when he was being set up to take the fall. "Lady," he said, turning to Karen and pulling off his hard hat, "there is no way in hell we are touching that property. You told us all the permits were in order. You lied. We're out of here." He signaled to his men. Without another word, they began loading the backhoe back onto the truck. "You can't leave!" Karen screamed, her voice a frantic, desperate thing. "I'm your client. I'll sue you." "Go ahead," the foreman grunted, not even looking at her. "Send the lawsuit to the same address as our bill. You're paying for our time." Within 10 minutes, they were gone. Karen was left alone on the side of the road, her face a mask of thwarted rage. She shot me a look of pure venom, then spun her golf cart around and sped away. I stopped the recording. I now had irrefutable video evidence of her attempt to direct a third party to commit a criminal act on my property. It was the kill shot. Or so I thought. The true kill shot was yet to come, and it would be delivered by a most unlikely source. 2 evenings later, my doorbell rang. It was after dark, which was unusual. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find a man standing on my porch, shifting nervously from foot to foot. He was a thin, balding man in his 50s, with the hunted look of a cornered rabbit. I recognized him from the HOA website. It was Arthur Pinter, the treasurer. "Mr. Henderson?" he stammered, avoiding my eyes. "I'm sorry to bother you at home. Can I speak with you for a moment?" I ushered him inside, a sense of foreboding and opportunity warring within me. I led him to the kitchen and offered him a seat. He perched on the edge of the chair as if ready to bolt at any moment. "I received a letter from your lawyer," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "The other board members did too. Brenda and the others. They're terrified. They want to call a special meeting to vote to retract the notice, but Karen won't allow it. She's out of control." "Why are you here, Arthur?" I asked gently. He finally met my gaze, and his eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and a desperate, flickering courage. "Because what she's doing is wrong. Not just to you, to everyone. The fines, the threats. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I just wanted to help with the neighborhood finances." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver USB drive. He slid it across the table toward me. "This is everything," he said, his voice cracking. "The full, unedited accounting records for the last 3 years. Not the simplified versions I present at the meetings. Everything. The bank statements, the vendor invoices, the credit card receipts." "Why are you giving this to me?" "Look at the Community Beautification Fund," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the windows. "Cross-reference the payments to a company called Miller Environmental. It's the same company she hired to come after you. It's owned by her brother-in-law. She's been using HOA funds to pay them for no-bid contracts, to do landscaping work on her own property, and then hiding the payments in that fund. She's been using our money to pay for her vendettas. She's stealing from us, Mr. Henderson, and I can't be a part of it anymore." He stood up abruptly. "I have to go. Please just use this to make it stop. But don't tell her it came from me. She'll ruin me." And then he was gone, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had arrived. I was left alone in my kitchen with the small silver drive. The inside source had delivered the keys to the kingdom. This was no longer just about harassment and property rights. This was now about embezzlement and fraud. The final piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. I had everything I needed to not just end the war, but to salt the earth of her entire regime. The annual HOA meeting was in 2 weeks. It would be the perfect battleground for the final confrontation. The night of the annual meeting arrived, thick with the humid promise of a summer storm. The venue was the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine from the adjacent pool and desperation. When David and I walked in, the room was already packed. Word had spread. The failed assault on my well house and the rumors of impending legal action had circulated through the neighborhood's gossip network like a virus. The air was tense with anticipation. Karen Miller and her 2 remaining board sycophants, Brenda the secretary and a man I didn't know, were seated at a long folding table at the front of the room, looking uncomfortable. Arthur, the treasurer, was also there, looking pale and ill, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Karen, however, was a study in defiant denial. She was wearing an aggressive, shoulder-padded blazer, her face set in a mask of belligerent authority. She banged a small, toy-like gavel to call the meeting to order. "The first item on the agenda," she began, her voice straining to sound normal, "is the ongoing enforcement action regarding the non-compliant property at 112 Old Farm Road." She glared directly at me. This was my cue. As per the plan David and I had rehearsed, he stood up first. "Madam President," David said, his voice calm and authoritative, filling the room. "My name is David Chen. I am legal counsel for Mr. Thomas Henderson. Any discussion of this enforcement action must begin with the fact that it is illegal, baseless, and has resulted in an official investigation by the North Carolina Department of Environmental Protection. A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face tightened. This is a community meeting, not a courtroom. Your client is in violation. My client is in violation of nothing, David interrupted smoothly. Your board, however, is in violation of state law, your own governing documents, and basic common sense. We have a video of you, Mrs. Miller, directing a contractor to commit criminal trespass. We have a pending tort claim for harassment. And we have a DEP case file that I'm sure the State Attorney General's office will be very interested in. He sat down. The room was silent. I stood up. My name is Tom Henderson, I said, letting my eyes sweep across the faces of my neighbors. For 2 years, I have lived peacefully beside you. I have bothered no one. Then, your board president decided to declare war on me over a well that has been on my family's land for nearly a century. A well, I might add, that is the primary source for the very aquifer this community draws its water from. Another, louder murmur rippled through the room. People started looking at each other, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning alarm. But this isn't just about me, I continued, my voice steady. This is about a pattern of abuse and intimidation. Mrs. Gable, would you be willing to share your experience? On cue, tiny Mrs. Gable stood up, her voice surprisingly strong. She told the room about the fines for her bird bath, her wind chimes, and the war on her garden gnomes. She spoke with the simple, powerful dignity of a wronged woman, and the room listened, rapt. When she finished, I nodded to the Martinezes. Mr. Martinez stood, his Air Force posture ramrod straight. He spoke about the constant, petty harassment his family had endured, the fines that seemed designed to punish them for simply having a child. We serve our country, he finished, his voice ringing with conviction. We shouldn't have to come home and fight a battle against our own homeowners association. The tide was turning. The fear in the room was being replaced by anger. Karen was sputtering, banging her gavel uselessly, but no one was listening to her anymore. Now, it was time for the coup de grace. This pattern of behavior is not just about a lust for power, I said, my voice dropping into a serious, somber tone. It's also about money. Arthur, would you please connect my laptop to the projector? Arthur, looking like a man walking to his own execution, fumbled with the cables. An image flashed onto the portable screen set up behind the board table. A spreadsheet. It was the HOA's detailed financial ledger. This is the HOA's complete, unaudited financial record for the past 3 years, provided to me by a concerned member of the community, I announced. I want to draw your attention to a line item called the Community Beautification Fund. Over the last 2 years, over $25,000 in resident fines and fees have been funneled into this fund. I clicked the mouse. A new slide appeared, showing a list of payments. And where did that money go? The vast majority, nearly $20,000, was paid to one vendor, Miller Environmental and Excavation, as in MILLER. A company, a quick search of state business records reveals, that is owned by one James Miller, the brother-in-law of your president, Karen Miller. The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting. Karen was ashen-faced, her jaw working silently. I have invoices, I said, my voice cutting through the din. Invoices for thousands of dollars for mulching services, tree trimming, and seasonal planting. But I also have satellite imagery and date-stamped photographs showing that the only property where Miller Environmental has ever done any significant work in this entire community is at the personal residence of Karen Miller. Chaos. It was pure, beautiful chaos. The edifice of her power, built on paper and fear, crumbled in an instant. David stood up again, his voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. "I would like to propose a motion," he boomed. "A motion for a vote of no confidence in the current board president and for the immediate removal of the entire board, pending a full, independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances." "Second!" shouted Mr. Martinez from the back of the room. "All in favor?" David called out. A deafening roar of "Aye!" shook the room. It was nearly unanimous. All opposed? Silence. Karen Miller sat frozen, her face a grotesque canvas of shock and humiliation. Brenda, the secretary, burst into tears. The petty tyrant had been overthrown. Her reign was over. She stared out at the sea of angry faces, the faces of the people she had bullied and fleeced, and for the first time, she seemed to understand that she had no power here at all. She stood up, knocking over her chair, and fled the room without a word. The aftermath was swift and decisive. In the vacuum of power, a new interim board was elected on the spot. It was composed of Mr. Martinez, a retired accountant, and, to my surprise, a very reluctant but resolute Arthur Pinter, who the community seemed to feel deserved a chance at redemption. Their first official act was to unanimously pass a motion to void every fine levied by Karen's board over the past 2 years. Their second was to issue a formal written apology to me, to Mrs. Gable, and to the Martinez family, which was delivered to my door the next day. Their third act was to hand over the USB drive and all my compiled evidence to the local police department and the state's attorney general. The legal and financial consequences for Karen were severe. She was charged with multiple counts of felony embezzlement. The HOA, under its new leadership, filed a civil suit against her to recover the stolen funds, and they won a judgment that forced her to sell her house to pay it. Within 6 months, a new family had moved into her beige McMansion. The reign of terror was officially and completely over. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed almost overnight. The oppressive sense of being watched, of constantly worrying about some minor infraction, evaporated. People started planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. Kids left their bikes on lawns. Mrs. Gable's garden gnome collection grew to an impressive and openly celebrated platoon. A sense of community, something Karen had talked about endlessly but had actively worked to destroy, began to actually grow. A month after the meeting, the Martinezes organized a neighborhood barbecue. They held it in the cul-de-sac in front of their house, and the entire community turned out. They invited me as the guest of honor. I was hesitant at first. My desire was for solitude, not celebration, but I went. I was no longer the strange old man on the hill. I was their liberator, their Cincinnatus, the man who had been called from his farm to save the Republic. They treated me with a quiet respect and gratitude that was more meaningful than any parade. Today, a year has passed. The peace I sought when I retired has returned, deeper and more profound than before. It is a peace that was fought for and won, not merely stumbled into. The whispering pines seem to whisper a little more freely. The creek chatters with a lighter tone. The water from my well, the well that started it all, has never tasted sweeter. The black binder, Operation Headwaters, sits on a high shelf in my study. I have not opened it since that night. It is a monument to a conflict I did not seek but did not shrink from. It is a testament to the fact that petty tyranny, whether in a nation or a neighborhood, thrives on the inaction of good people. It proves that a single, determined individual, armed with the truth and a well-organized plan, can dismantle an empire of arrogance. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I walk out to the old stone wall and look out over the estates at Whispering Pines. The houses are still beige, the lawns still a bit too perfect for my taste. But there are splashes of color now, signs of life and individuality. A basketball hoop stands proudly at the end of a driveway. A rogue plastic flamingo stands guard over a mailbox. And in the distance, I can just make out the colorful caps of Mrs. Gable's gnomes standing in defiant, joyful assembly. My neighbors are free, and I am at peace. The campaign is over. The victory is total.